Hi guys, I have a composition today of 3 red peppers starting out with a cone shape. This is an assignment that I like to give the students in my watercolor class. It's another study that helps develop an understanding of modeling of form, color theory, and just the basic understanding of the states and stages of watercolor. Let's get started sketching this piece up. We're going to start with a basic cone shape, the long promised cone tutorial. Basic cones, distorting those shapes. That's not a perfect cone. We have some perspective that we're working with, some foreshortening. We have a cylinder for the stem. We have little triangles for the leaves on the stem. Sketching in some of the highlights, where the highlights will be where the transition from the shade or the tone on the peppers transitioning into the shade. I like to draw the terminus edge, the transitions where it's starting to go into the shade, adding a little more of the detail, the structure, the variation on the edge. We have these cones pointing in different directions. And if you can get the angles right, if you can get the shapes right, if you can get all those things to read correctly, you've done quite a bit of the work. And it's just a matter of dropping in the color, controlling the modeling, getting the shades in there, working your color theory, all the things we've been working with in previous tutorials, working with those states and stages of watercolor. Soft edges, sharp edges, highlights. Just sketching it up. A little more detail. How detailed is up to you. How much detail do you need when you start working with your color? I just like some rough indications. Make sure I got the shapes right, the shadows planted in there. And we're going to start dropping some color in on this. It's going to be a fairly simple color palette. Red and green. We'll work in some contrasting color for shades and some shadows. A little more complex color using some purples and blues. We'll definitely be working with green on the stems. Kind of have made the decision on this piece that I will just simply either pick out some highlights and you'll see some modeling after the initial blocking, and then I'll just paint in the highlights with some Pro White at the back end. Again, these little shape exercises, these compositions with veggies and fruit, they're great ways to practice and hone your skills with the states and stages of watercolor. Develop that confidence that you'll need when you want to start painting scenes. I'm going to just throw a little of the water red, let some of that pink flow into the background, into the shadows areas. We have some really wet on wet action going there. Yeah, it just gives the background a little more information, a little more interest. Had a little spot there, had to wet it down. Just brings that color from the vegetable, from the pepper into the environment as well. The color, it's fugitive. It goes everywhere. So mixing up some green, blocking in the stems. Starting out with wet on dry, coming back in with some wet on wet. Getting some color variations and variety. I'm working on a Canson paper, so this is drying pretty quick. I got a nice little color bloom on top there. Going to add a little more saturation to the pepper. A little more color, a little redder red. Picking out some of those blooms. Softening that edge or tightening it up in that case. All right, coming in with a damp brush, I'm just separating that color that I have in the background away from the edge of that pepper. I want a little contrast there. I'm going to do the same thing down here on the shadow, a nice soft edge shadow where that wet on wet transition happened. A little more color density there, a little darker red. Mix a little purple into the red so it's a darker overall color underneath where the shadow of that one pepper sitting on top of the other pepper. I'm going to start building some of the form in and around the top, the shadows. A little distinction from the stem leaves on the top there. Painting with a green, a dark green, a lot of contrast there. Pulled that green into the red down there on the shadow side. Building definition. We're definitely into stage 2 here, where I am finding bigger shapes, adding saturation, building the structure. That color has a little purple in it. The red with some blue or even a violet. Getting the shadow side, it's a sharper edge now. A little thicker paint. Directional marks there, trying to get kind of a sense of the form of the pepper. Then I softened it up. Some overlap lines. Softening it up again. I want those nice soft transitions. Pulling a little structure in. There's a nice overlap there. Again, I when I'm drawing with paint, I try to keep my marks angular. I can always soften them up. I don't want noodle peppers. I want a good structured pepper. Looking for that contrast, that structure. Right now they just look like they're floating. I haven't done anything with the surface of the table that they're sitting on. Just working the shadows, highlights, and structure right now. So a little bit of stage 3. I'm really at stage 2 still, but I'm doing just a smidge of stage 3 work, that structural work right now as well. So it is fairly fluid. What you do at what point on the piece, it just depends on where you can work, what's wet, what's dry. Introducing some violet, some of that purple into the shadow. This is not a black. I see students a lot of times, they think shadows are black, and they're not. They're a color, and they can vary. So I'm got a nice red tint in that underpainting that now I'm going to work in the violet, and those two are harmonious colors, so they should interact well together. You're not going to create any mud. I'm going to soften the edges. A little more saturation into it. And I have a grayish green. Oh, I was cleaning my palette. That's why it was gray. Alright, so I want some more red. There we go. Is that red enough, Rusty? There we go. Now we're saturating again. Doing some glazing. Intensifying those reds. I'm not worried about the highlights. I can come back in and rescue them either through picking or through painting them on with Pro White. The colors are very flat when I'm doing this. I have a little modulation on the surface of the pepper. Now I'm just over glazing it again. So it's going to kind of start appearing fairly flat. And that's going to bother me. So I'm going to come back in pretty quick and start picking and modulating the colors. I just wanted to get the saturation a little denser. So it looks more like a pepper graphic than a three-dimensional pepper. So I haven't found any of the shapes or the modulation on the surface yet. And now it's time for picking highlights, creating form, getting those transitions, light to dark, reflected light on the underneath side there. We got the highlights on the little bulbous tops of the peppers to pick in. Nice soft highlights too, they're not sharp. Accentuating that overlap there. There's a nice contrast light line against a dark line. Reflected light there. Nice contrast line there. Starting to work a little more directional mark making right there. All right, working a little more color modulation just to create a sense of better form so the colors aren't so flat. Just picking out that pigment, putting a little highlight against that really dark shadow, bringing up the value a little bit inside the shadow. So a continuation of just painting simple shapes, simple subject matter, practicing all of our skills, getting correct shapes, working those states and stages of watercolor, gaining confidence, learning how to draw with a brush, creating lines, when to use shapes, soft edges, sharp edges. How do I do it without outlining? That's always an issue I see with students as they're developing their work. Sometimes they really overuse of outline, especially if they're more comfortable with drawing. They tend to do that. In picking, I'm using the subtractive method, looking for those highlights, adding a little more saturation. Again, just trying to build form. Using that sharp number 2 brush, it looks like, number 2 round. More textural marks in on the stem, more contrast. And we're coming down to the end of this piece. The highlights need to be popped in. I'm still working a bit more of the contrast there on the stems, in the shadows. But it's time to start looking for the highlights, adding those little bursts of white that really start popping the form and the shapes on it. I think if I did anything that I didn't like on this one, it would be probably coming up. I think I overused the Pro White too much at the back end, especially on the foreground pepper. So you'll see that. It looks just a little too opaque and painted. I should have probably spent more time working on the highlight, picking out a better range of value on the highlights, and then popped it with the little less heavy use of the Pro White. Like on the tips of the back peppers, it worked pretty well, but I think on the foreground pepper, I think it was a little heavy-handed. So, but you know, that's what you do with studies. You test things out, see how it works. It looked good when it went on wet, but when it dried, it just looked a little too opaque, too sharp, I think. So I should have worked a little more highlight into the form on the pepper before I popped it with the Pro White. So I have to remember that in future peppers that I might do. I now know what to do whenever I paint a pepper in the future. So I'm building my vocabulary. We're learning when to do what and how. So just file that away and keep working and developing your skills. Practice these simple things. I know these little tutorials, these little still lifes of objects may not be terribly sexy things that you really want to paint, but they do develop skills, and that's what you're looking for. Sit down and do a few of these in between scenes when you're trying to paint scenes and things that you want to do, and let these exercises develop your knowledge base, your skill sets, your confidence. And as we're coming to an end, I want to thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you learned something. I hope it is something that you can practice and develop your skills and get better at. These are fun to do. They're good exercises. I give these kind of exercises to my students up at the university all the time. Practice them, get good at it. Here's the final. If you like this tutorial, give me a like and a subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial.